Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story that begins with a bell so old that even the crows seem to argue over whether IT truly existed. Somewhere beyond winding roads, sleepy forests, and hills that looked as though giants had folded them like blankets. That is either the finest piece of medieval storytelling ever invented or the world's most inconvenient alarm clock. Either way, tonight you're in for the tale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love for you to leave a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what the local time is where you are. It's always wonderful imagining this story traveling farther than any wandering merchant ever could. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Aldrin, no sword polished enough for knights to admire, a quality that often filled his days with wonders and occasionally filled them with problems. On an early autumn morning, while mist drifted lazily across the fields like sheep that had forgotten where they belonged, turning the earth with wooden plows, while geese loudly criticized every decision they made. If geese had ruled kingdoms, cart tracks cut through the damp soil. Tall oaks leaned overhead. The air carried the smell of wet leaves, fresh bread from distant cottages, women selling onions, herbs, and little bundles of dried flowers outside a roadside shrine. She studied him with eyes that seemed older than the stones beneath her feet. "You walk north," she observed. "I do. You'll reach Gray Hollow if your legs remain faithful." "My legs usually complain," Aldrin answered, "but they rarely resign." The old woman chuckled. "Then perhaps you'll hear IT." "Hear what?" She simply pointed toward the distant mountains. The bell. Aldrin waited. She saw nothing more. People often believed mysterious silence made them sound wise. Sometimes IT worked. Other times IT merely delayed lunch. "What bell?" he finally asked. "The one that rings once each century." Dozens of strange tailies during his travels. Wheels that granted impossible luck. Forests where deer bowed to monks. Fish, supposedly, large enough to swallow entire fishing boats. That last story became much less impressive after discovering the fisherman telling IT had also been sampling unusually strong cider. Still, she merely spoke as someone repeating something accepted as plainly as sunrise. "Does IT truly ring?" Aldrin asked. She shrugged. "My grandmother heard IT, and her grandmother. So the story goes. Why only once every 100 years?" The old woman smiled. If everyone knew that answer, nitrogen monoxide 1 would bother making the journey. With that, their conversation ended. Aldrin continued north. The hills gradually became steeper. Stone fences divided fields where sheep grazed lazily, occasionally staring at passing travelers with an expression suggesting they had solved life's greatest mysteries and found humanity disappointingly slow to catch up. The villages grew farther apart. Roadside chapels appeared less frequently. Streams became colder. The wind smelled cleaner. As daylight stretched across the countryside, "Have you heard about a bell there?" The merchant looked toward his companions. None laughed. Instead, they exchanged the uncomfortable glance shared by people remembering something difficult. "My father heard IT," the merchant finally replied. "And?" He spoke little afterward. "Out of fear? No. Wonder?" The merchant considered the question. as though he had remembered something he never realized he had forgotten. The sunlight into soft, golden ribbons. Squirrels darted across branches overhead. A woodpecker hammered patiently against an ancient trunk, almost hidden beneath moss. Unlike the milestones placed by lords, this one carried nitrogen monoxide distance. Instead, someone centuries earlier had carved a single image, a bell, nothing else. Nitrogen monoxide words, nitrogen monoxide names. Only the careful outline of a bell surrounded by tiny... He brushed away more moss with his sleeve. The carving remained, astonishingly sharp despite its age. Whoever created IT had expected, remembered from a monastery library years before. Some medieval bell founders believed a newly cast bell possessed a voice unique to the mixture of metals used in its making. Tiny changes in copper OR10 could alter its sound enough that experienced craftsmen claimed they recognized individual bells without seeing them. Whether entirely true or not, entire villages often spoke of their bells almost as though they were old friends with personalities of their own. He smiled at the memory. Perhaps the legendary bell possessed its own personality as well. If so, IT certainly enjoyed making people wait. As evening approached, clouds gathered around the mountain peaks without threatening rain. The air cooled. Birdsong faded. Even the breeze seemed quieter. Ahead, nestled between dark green slopes, something about its shape caught the eye. High above the roof rested a bell chamber, open to the wind. Nitrogen monoxide sound emerged from IT. Only silence, deep, patient, ancient. Aldrin stood for several long moments watching the tower while daylight slowly surrendered to dusk. He could not have explained why his heartbeat seemed just a little slower than before. Perhaps IT was exhaustion, perhaps the mountain air, or perhaps some places carry centuries so gently that anyone arriving can almost feel time itself settling quietly upon their shoulders. With one last glance toward the silent tower, he resumed walking down the winding path toward the waiting village, unaware that the oldest story he had ever chased was only beginning. Slate. Thin curls of smoke drifted from chimneys, carrying the comforting sense of oat porridge, onions, roasted turnips, and fresh rye bread. Children had already disappeared indoors. Dogs barked only once before deciding the newcomer looked too tired to be worth much excitement. Even the chickens seemed unusually polite. That alone should. Chickens rarely missed an opportunity to create chaos. He crossed a small stone bridge over a stream, so clear that smooth pebbles shone beneath its surface like polished silver coins. The water whispered constantly over the rocks, a sound so gentle it almost felt as though the valley itself preferred quiet conversations over loud declarations. An elderly man sat beside the bridge repairing a fishing net. Without looking up, he asked, "Traveler?" "I am." "Passing through?" "I thought perhaps I'd stay a few days." Only then did the old man raise his eyes. For the bell? News traveled strangely in isolated places. Either everyone knew everything, or nitrogen monoxide, one knew anything at all. Aldrin nodded. "If I'm welcome." The fisherman smiled faintly. "Everyone who comes for the bell says that. And afterward, they usually leave with fewer questions. Do they find answers?" The old man returned to his net. Sometimes, as Aldrin continued through the village, he noticed something else. Nearly every doorway displayed A small bronze bell nitrogen monoxide, larger than a clenched fist. None looked expensive. None appeared decorative. Some were polished brightly, while others had turned green with age. Yet every household possessed one. Not a single cottage lacked IT. A woman sweeping. Her doorstep caught him staring. You've noticed. I have. Most visitors do. What are they for? But traditions survive longer than explanations. That thought stayed with him. Perhaps that happened more often than people realized. A custom began for one sensible reason. Generations passed. The reason faded. The custom remained. Near the center of the village stood a modest square where a stone well served as the gathering place for neighbors. Several women filled buckets. Others claimed squirrels had grown lazy. Neither seemed likely to convince the other before spring. Aldrin smiled to himself. Some debates clearly outlived the people having them. A baker emerged from his shop, carrying fresh loaves whose warm aroma drifted across the square. The scent alone nearly persuaded Aldrin that bread might actually possess magical powers. After purchasing a loaf with a few small coins, he found a bench beside the well. He had barely taken 2 bites before a young boy approached. The child couldn't have been older than 10. You came for the ringing. I did. The boy folded his arms importantly. I've never heard IT. Neither have the first. My grandfather says it sounds like the whole mountain remembering its own name. Children often repeated extraordinary things with complete seriousness. Sometimes they repeated them because adults had invented stories. Other times because adults had forgotten how to describe remarkable experiences any other way. Do you believe him? Aldrin asked. The boy thought carefully. I think he believes himself. An excellent answer. Before Aldrin could continue, the boy's mother called him home. The child waved once before running across the square. Night settled gently over Gray Hollow. Oil lamps glowed inside cottage windows. The stars emerged one by one until the sky resembled a great velvet cloak stitched with tiny silver threads. Far above everything stood the church tower, dark, silent, watching after finding. The village had grown astonishingly quiet. Nitrogen monoxide shouting, nitrogen monoxide drunken, singing, nitrogen monoxide, carts rumbling through muddy streets, only distant owls and the steady murmur of the stream. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. As he stood beneath the stars, Mara joined him, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders. You keep looking at the tower. I suppose I do. You expected something grander? I expected. He searched for the right word. More. She laughed softly. So does nearly everyone. But isn't this the place where the bell waits? IT is. The greatest mistake visitors make is expecting legends to live in extraordinary places. She pointed toward the nearest cottage. See that roof? Aldrin nodded. My father repaired IT 40 years ago. She pointed toward another house. My sister was born there. Then toward the fields. My husband planted those apple trees. Finally, she looked at the tower, and the bell watches all of IT. A little longer, the air had become pleasantly cold. Somewhere nearby, a sheep sneezed with surprising determination. Even the mountains seemed briefly startled. He chuckled quietly. Nature possessed. He noticed tiny details overlooked the evening before. Every path had been carefully swept. Stone walls had been repaired countless times rather than rebuilt. Gardens contained herbs for medicine alongside vegetables for supper. Nothing was extravagant. Everything served a purpose. Near the churchyard he found several elderly women polishing small handbells with claws dipped in oil. Aldrin asked politely. One woman smiled. We always prepare, but the ringing hasn't happened yet. Nitrogen monoxide. Then why now? She continued polishing. Preparation is easier when IT becomes habit. Church bells were sometimes believed to protect villages from violent storms. During threatening weather, bell ringers would sound them in hopes that their voices carried blessings across fields and frightened away destructive hail. Whether the storms listened was another matter entirely, but the practice endured for centuries, because hope itself can become a tradition. Perhaps Gray Hollow understood that better than most places, as Aldrin approached the church gate, someone whose daily life still revolved around the silent giant above. Without realizing it, for the first time he suspected he was about to meet the man who had spent, kneeling with a small brush in one hand and a clay bowl of oil in the other. He was cleaning the iron hinges slowly, patiently, as though each dark curve of metal deserved the same attention a king might give his crown. The man was old, but not fragile. His shoulders remained broad beneath his plain wool tunic. His hands were knotted with age, work, and weather. His beard, white as flour dust, reached almost to his chest, and his eyes were the clear gray of winter mornings. He did not look up at once. You walk softly for a man full of questions, he said. Aldrin paused. I did not mean to disturb you. You have already disturbed the dust. That is enough for one morning. The old man dipped the brush again and continued working. Aldrin waited. After a while, the keeper glanced over his shoulder. Well, I am Aldrin. I am Orn, the bell keeper. The door hinge cleaner, apparently. Aldrin smiled. Is that part of the sacred duty? Everything becomes sacred when neglected. Long Enoughh. That was the first thing Orn sighed that sounded less like village mystery and more like simple truth. He stood slowly, joints cracking in a manner that made nearby ravens look concerned. Then he wiped his hands on a cloth and studied Aldrin from boots to brow. You came for the ringing? Yes, many do. I have heard that. Most expect thunder, fire in the sky, angels leaning out of clouds with trumpets, very theatrical, terrible for the livestock. And what should I expect? Orn looked up at the tower. One sound. That is all? That is enough? The bell chamber rose high above them. Aldrin asked, Since I was younger than you, and before that? She climbed faster than any man in the valley and swore better than most, though never where the priest could hear, a practical arrangement. Aldrin laughed softly. And before her, her uncle. Before him, his grandmother. Before her, but people prefer saying the bell doze. It sounds wiser and avoids arguments. Orrin opened the tower door. The hinges gave only the smallest sigh, which seemed to please him immensely. Inside, cool air breathed outward. A spiral stair climbed upward into dimness. Stone walls curved tightly around the narrow space. Instead, he closed the door again and leaned against IT. My duty is simple, he said. Keep the tower sound. Keep the rope clean. Keep the bell untouched until the appointed dawn. And when the dawn comes, I pull once. I do not. But what if someone did? Then someone would have mistaken curiosity for wisdom, which is a very common illness and tragically difficult to cure. FAIR enough. Aldrin looked toward the quiet square, where villagers moved about their morning tasks. A woman carried water. A boy chased. A hammer struck wood in steady rhythm. Do they all know UHY? Aldrin asked. Why the bell rings only once a century? Yes. Some think they do. And you? Orrin folded the cloth carefully. I know enough to obey. You could try to take IT, naturally, but the cat had opinions. May I see IT? Aldrin asked. The bell? Yes. Nitrogen monoxide. At least the old man was efficient. Not ever? Not today. When? When IT becomes necessary. Aldrin almost asked when that would be, then stopped himself. He had begun to recognize the rhythm of this valley. Questions were permitted. Good. You learn faster than most. I was about to ask something foolish that places you ahead of many nobles. Together they walked around the churchyard. The graves were old, some marked by carved stones leaning at gentle angles beneath grass and wild thyme. Many bore small bell symbols instead of family crests. Orrin paused beside one weathered marker. My mother, he sighed. Orrin looked toward the mountains. She saw an IT made every lie in her life feel too heavy to carry. Aldrin felt the words settle between them. Nitrogen monoxide thunder. Nitrogen monoxide curse. Nitrogen monoxide prophecy. Something quieter, perhaps more dangerous. What did she do afterward? Return 3 stolen hens. Aldrin blinked. Orrin's mouth twitched. She had taken them from a neighbor during a winter famine, intending to confess later. Later became 20 years. The bell has a way of making later feel rather embarrassing. One Aldrin had once heard from a wandering scholar. In some old bell towers, keepers placed straw or wool near cracks in the stone during winter to see where drafts entered, because moving air could damage ropes and wooden frames over many years. A tower, like an old body, complained softly before IT failed loudly. Orrin seemed exactly the sort of man who listened to such complaints. He sighed. A bell is never only a bell. IT tells time. IT calls prayer. IT warns of fire, flood, raiders, births, deaths, weddings, feast days, and fools climbing where they should not. A village hears itself through its bell. And this one? This one lets the village hear what has survived. Aldrin looked at him closely. What has survived? Orrin's expression softened, but his voice remained guarded. Promises, mostly. Shaking drops of morning mist from the grass. The tower stood above them, silent and immovable, holding its secret with infuriating patience. Orrin began walking back toward the door. Aldrin followed. "For why tell me this much?" he asked. The old keeper rested one hand on the iron latch. "Because you listen without trying to own the story." Then he opened the door just enough to retrieve his bowl and brush. Before stepping inside, he turned. "Come tomorrow before sunrise. Bring steady feet and fewer clever questions." I cannot promise the second, nitrogen monoxide. Men rarely can. Aldrin remained outside with the chill air on his face and the keeper's words turning slowly in his mind. He had remembered stolen chickens and treated silence as carefully as a priest handled relics. Above him, unseen in the dark chamber, the ancient bell waited. Not sleeping, not dead, simply patient. And patience, Aldrin was beginning to understand, could be the heaviest sound of all. The next morning did not hurry. Gray Hollow woke slowly, as though the whole valley had agreed that dawn was a respectable idea, but needed time to prove itself. Mist rested low over the fields. Dew silvered the grass. Somewhere behind a cottage, a rooster gave one heroic cry, paused, and then sounded deeply disappointed by his own effort. Aldrin rose from his narrow bed before Mara knocked. This impressed her greatly, or at least mildly. For a woman who had outlived 2 husbands, 3 hard winters, and an entire generation of village gossip. For the tower, she sighed. I thought Oren told me to come before sunrise. He did. Does everyone know everything here? Only after breakfast. Aldrin accepted this as village law and went outside. The churchyard lay quiet beneath a pale sky. Oren was already waiting near the tower door with a lantern in one hand and a coil of thin cord over one shoulder. You were instructed, that too. And faint traces of oil. The stair wound upward tightly, its steps uneven from centuries of feet. Aldrin placed one hand against the wall, because the 24th is rude. Aldrin ducked just in time beneath a low stone arch that seemed personally interested in removing his hat. They climbed in silence for a while. The higher they went, the colder the air became. Small slits in the wall admitted thin blades of morning light. Through them, Aldrin glimpsed fragments of the valley, a garden wall, a rising chimney plume, sheep clustered in a field like spilled wool, the stream shining between reeds. At the first landing, Oren stopped. The space opened into a small chamber lined with worn shelves. Several clay jars stood sealed with wax. Bundles of dried herbs hung from pegs. A wooden chest sat beneath the narrow window, its iron bands dark with age. What is this place? Aldrin asked. Storage? For what? Things that should not be stored carelessly. Oren opened the chest. Inside lay old tools wrapped in linen. Chisels, wedges, a small hammer, measuring cords, scraps of parchment, and pieces of bronze nitrogen monoxide larger than fingernails. Aldrin leaned closer. From the bell? From repairs made to its frame, not the bell itself. The bronze has never been cut. He lifted one tiny dark fragment. Bell metal is strange stuff. Too much tin and IT becomes brittle. Too little and IT loses brightness. Founders guarded their mixtures like cooks guarding stew recipes, only with more fire and fewer onions. That sounds dangerous. Most crafts worth remembering are. The eccentric curiosity of the place revealed itself on a shelf nearby. A row of little wooden mice, each carved differently. One had enormous ears. Another wore a tiny. Should I ask? No. He waited. Oren sighed. My mother's habit. She carved one each winter to mark that the tower had survived another year without real mice chewing the ropes. She believed false mice discouraged true ones. Did IT work? No idea. But the ropes remained mostly unchewed, so argue with that if you dare. The stone blocks bore carvings. Some were simple. Hands, leaves, stars, bells. Others were stranger. A fox carrying a key, a sleeping giant beneath waves, a woman holding an empty bowl toward the moon. Lines of script curled between the images, but many had faded almost beyond reading. Aldrin traced one inscription gently without touching. IT. What does this say? Oren brought the lantern close. Remember what hunger teaches before harvest makes you proud. The words felt older than sermon and sharper than proverb. Another carving showed 3 villages joined by a braided cord. Beneath IT, someone had written, in a way, warnings. in a better way. Long ago, before the bell was cast, these villages quarreled badly, not with armies or banners. Nothing so grand. IT began with pasture rights, mill fees, water channels, and who owed whom grain after a poor harvest. That sounds ordinary. Most disasters do at first. Not yet. You keep saying that because it remains true. They continued upward. The stair grew narrower. The wind became audible above them, slipping through the bell chamber with a low breath. Finally they reached, but enough to remind him that even stone was never perfectly still. Oren knelt beside one beam and tapped IT with his knuckles. He listened. Then he tapped again. "What are you doing?" Aldrin whispered, though he did not know why whispering seemed necessary. "Hearing whether the wood has changed." "Can you tell?" "Sometimes. From tapping." "Wood speaks. People simply prefer interrupting." Aldrin smiled. The old keeper checked pegs, ropes, braces, and iron fastenings with careful attention. None of IT appeared ceremonial. It looked like work. Plain, necessary, patient work. Yet the longer Aldrin watched, the legend did not survive because people believed in IT from a distance. IT survived because someone climbed cold stairs before sunrise and made sure old wood did not fail. At last, Oren lead him through a narrow arch into the bell chamber. The great bell hung above them. Aldrin stopped breathing for a moment. IT was larger than he had imagined. Dark bronze touched with green at the edges, its curved body marked by centuries of weather. Around its rim ran raised letters in an old script, interrupted by tiny figures of birds, wheat, hands, and flowing water. It did not gleam. It did not need to. The bell possessed the quiet dignity of something that had outlasted vanity. Aldrin stood beneath IT, feeling suddenly small. "Do not touch IT," Oren said. "I will not." "Everyone says that. I mean IT." "Good. I dislike throwing guests downstairs." The wheel above descending through the floor toward the lower chamber. Its fibers were clean, braided, and almost new. "You replace the rope?" "Whether IT needs IT or not." Let one voice carry what many hands forgot. The wind moved through the chamber. Far below, Gray Hollow began its morning. Doors opening, tools, false mice, warnings, and bronze letters gathering inside him like pieces of a map. The bell was not merely old. IT had been made to remember something, and whatever that something was. The fog had lifted, and Gray Hollow had resumed the ordinary business of staying alive. Bread cooled on window ledges. Goats tested fences with the dedication of trained thieves. A woman scolded her youngest son for trying to trade his shoes for a wooden whistle, which, to be fair, was ambitious commerce for someone still sticky with breakfast. Aldrin carried, like a cloak borrowed from someone taller. Oren noticed. Oh, of course. Old men like him noticed everything except, apparently, where Oren went to speak with two masons, inspecting a low wall around the churchyard. Aldrin remained beside the water, staring into its dark, round mouth. The bucket rope creaked faintly in the breeze. Something was changing in the village, not dramatically. Nitrogen monoxide 1 ran screaming through the lanes. Nitrogen monoxide mysterious riders appeared on black horses. Nitrogen monoxide Raven landed on a roof and announced doom, which was probably for the best, since Ravens already looked smug enough without public speaking. Still, there were signs. A woman passing, The well paused to touch the small bell beside her door before entering. A shepherd tied a red thread around the neck of his lead way. Children were told to come indoors before sunset, though the evening was still hours away. At the edge of the square, 3 men repaired a wagon, wheel that did not appear broken. Everything looked practical. Everything felt symbolic. That afternoon, the herb gardens behind Mara's cottage, then deepening until it seemed almost like the tower breathing in its sleep. Mara stepped outside with a wooden spoon in one hand. "Oh," she sighed, "that sounds bad. IT is not bad." "Then why did you say oh as though someone had dropped a bishop into a pond?" She gave him a look. "Because IT is unusual." The bees moved as one body, circling above the thyme and sage. Then, instead of flying toward the woods, they drifted slowly toward the church tower. People emerged from houses. "Nitrogen monoxide 1, shouted. "Nitrogen monoxide 1, struck at the insects. They simply watched. The swarm reached the churchyard and settled in the old yew tree near Orne's mother's grave. "Has this happened before?" he asked. "My grandmother said IT happened before the last ringing." "You believe her?" "I believe she remembered being frightened." "That was not quite the same thing," Aldrin whispered, inviting them politely. "Politely?" "Bees dislike rude moving arrangements." That, Aldrin thought, was perhaps the most unreasonable thing he had heard all week. The eccentric curiosity was that many villages treated bees almost like tiny household members. Families sometimes told hives about weddings, deaths, and changes in fortune, believing bees might sicken or leave if ignored. Aldrin had once heard of a widow who dyed black cloth around her hives after her husband died, just to make sure the bees knew the household was grieving. IT sounded strange. Yes, but also oddly courteous. Honestly, more people should be that considerate to creatures with stingers. Tavern eventually coaxed the swarm into the skep. When he carried IT away, the hum faded and the village exhaled, but the signs did not stop. Near sunset, the stream changed color. Not red, not black, nothing theatrical enough for a bad minstrel's song. IT turned silver. For several minutes, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the water caught the light so strongly that the whole stream shone like molten metal slipping between the stones. Children gathered along the bridge, whispering. Adults pretended not to be impressed and failed completely. Aldrin stood with Orrin near the bank. "Does that happen often?" Aldrin asked. "No." "What causes IT?" "Light. That seems too simple." "Most omens are simple things wearing important shoes. Cold stone, crushed apples, pine resin, smoke from hearth fires, and the faint mineral smell of the stream." Aldrin lay awake in Mara's guest room, listening. From somewhere outside came a quiet tinkling. One bell, then another, then several more. Their little bronze bells hanging at cottage doors were trembling in the wind. Their sounds were tiny, uneven, delicate. Not music. Not exactly. Doorway bells stirred lightly, chiming without human hands. Across the way, Mara stood at her own door, one finger to her lips, not because the bells required silence, because the village did. The tiny sounds continued for several minutes. Then, all at once, the wind stopped. The bells fell still. The silence afterward seemed deeper than before. In the morning, Aldrin found people drawing chalk marks near their thresholds. Each mark was simple. a small circle with a line beneath IT, like the shape of a bell seen by a child. No one explained much. A few smiled when asked. Others claimed it was only habit. Oren, when found near the tower, gave the most Oren answer imaginable. Marks help people remember what they already know. That explains almost nothing. IT explains the NOUGH. By noon, the sky filled with birds. They came from the woods in loose, shifting flocks. Starlings, rooks, finches, and small brown birds Aldrin could not name. They wheeled above the valley without landing, folding and unfolding their shapes across. Have doubted IT. If every villager had not stopped working at once. A little girl beside him whispered, "They know." Know what? When to listen. That evening the oldest villagers gathered near the well. They spoke in low voices, recalling what their parents and grandparents had told them of the last ringing. The bees had swarmed then. The doorbells had chimed in still air. A white stag had supposedly been seen above the eastern pasture. So perhaps the stag had been more enthusiastic than real. No one laughed loudly, but smiles passed around the circle. The omens frightened them. He thought of the carvings in the tower. Hunger, harvest, hands, promises. He thought of Oren's mother returning stolen hens after 20 years. He thought of small bells at every door and villagers who prepared not with panic, but with sweeping, mending, polishing, and bread. Whatever the ringing brought, Grey Hollow was not trying to escape IT. They were making themselves ready to hear. Above the village, the great bell remained unseen in its chamber, dark against the stars. One more day had passed. The appointed century drew nearer. And for the first time since arriving, Haldren felt not curiosity, but reverence. By sunrise, Grey Hollow had become the quietest, busy place Aldrin had ever seen. Nitrogen monoxide, one rushed. IT was like watching an entire village prepare for a royal visit, except the honored guest was sound itself, which made the seating arrangements much simpler, and probably saved everyone from arguing. Thump of kneading bread, the splash of water in basins, the rustle of linen being shaken out and folded. When he came downstairs, she had already placed 3 round loaves on the table, each marked with a simple cross and a tiny bell shape pressed into the crust. "For the ceremony?" he asked. "For the families who will climb to the tower, to the churchyard. Only Oren climbs the tower. And Emmy, you are being tolerated. I shall try to deserve such honor. Begin by eating." The path leading from the square to the church. Women carried baskets of bread. Elderly villagers sat beneath awnings, sorting ribbons by color with the seriousness of judges deciding land disputes. IT must also last. How long? She gave him a patient look. Longer than U.S. FEIR. Enough. Near the well, families brought their small doorway bells one by one. Each bell was cleaned, named aloud by household, and placed on a long linen cloth. Some bells had been passed down for generations. Others were newly cast. One belonged to a cottage rebuilt after a fire. Another had been carried by a bride from a neighboring valley 80 years earlier. A tiny cracked bell was placed carefully between 2 polished ones, because silence also belongs. Oren appeared carrying a wooden staff topped with iron. The staff looked plain except for small notches carved, were becoming visible without being spoken. The keeper stopped at the churchyard gate, where 3 masons inspected the path stones one final time. He nodded once. then continued toward the tower without ceremony. The villagers watched him go, not with fear, not when he calls, if he calls, he will. The ceremony unfolded slowly through the day. There were nitrogen monoxide grand speeches at first. Instead, each household brought something ordinary and placed IT near the churchyard wall: a sack of barley, a spindle of wool, a jar of salt, a bundle of candles, a repaired. Aldrin found the offerings humble, almost embarrassingly plain. Then he began to understand. The bell did not ask for treasure. IT asked for proof. Proof that people had, lived, worked, shared, failed, mended, tried again. Around noon, the villagers gathered for the reading of names. Not every name of every ancestor, which would have required several days and a stronger supply of patience than any mortal village possessed. Instead, each family spoke the oldest name they still knew, and the youngest child born under their roof, past and future, tied by breath. One man forgot his great-grandmother's name and looked mortified until his little daughter whispered it loudly enough for everyone to hear. The village smiled, and the man blushed so red he looked briefly in danger of being harvested with the apples. An eccentric custom appeared during the afternoon meal. Before anyone ate, a small portion of bread was broken and placed on the churchyard wall. For those walking late, Aldrin asked whether this meant travelers, spirits, or the poor. Mara answered, yes, which was both unhelpful and strangely complete. Medieval villages often fed meaning into small acts, because life was uncertain enough without leaving kindness to chance. A crust set aside could be charity, memory, superstition, hospitality, or all four at once. Labels were less important than the hand that offered IT. As the sun lowered, Orn finally emerged from the tower. He carried the bell rope's end coiled over both arms. The village fell still. Aldrin saw then that the rope did not hang freely through the tower, as he had imagined. For most of the century, IT had been secured above, unreachable. Now, Oren brought IT down for inspection. IT's pale fibers thick as a man's wrist. He laid IT across the linen cloth beside the household bells. Nitrogen monoxide, 1, touched IT. Oren spoke, voice low but clear. Tomorrow at first light, one voice will sound. The villagers bowed their heads. He continued, we bring what we have kept. We name what we remember. We forgive what we can. We carry what remains carefully. Families tied the colored ribbons to the churchyard fence. Blue, gold, white, red, and green fluttered in the mountain breeze. Children were lifted so they could tie theirs high. Elders tied theirs low. The whole fence became a woven border of memory, trembling softly in the fading light. Mara handed Aldrin a plain gray ribbon. I am not from here, he sighed. You are here now. What does gray mean? Witness. He tied it carefully beside the gate. For reasons he did not fully understand, his fingers shook. Night came calm and cold. The villagers shared food in the square, speaking softly. There was laughter, too, because solemnity without laughter becomes unbearable, and worse, boring. Someone told the story of a past keeper who once got stuck halfway up the tower because his belt caught on a nail, and he refused to call for help for nearly an hour. This was presented as dignity. Aldrin suspected IT was stubbornness. Wearing ceremonial boots, when the meal ended, no one removed the offerings. No one took back the bells. each household returned home without ringing them. The village entered silence deliberately. Doors closed, lamps dimmed, the stream murmured under the stars. Aldrin stood beside Mara outside her cottage, looking toward the tower. Its dark shape rose against the moonlit ridge, and above it, the sky seemed impossibly deep. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Of what the bell will do? Of what I may hear in myself?" That answer was too honest for comfort. Before sleeping, Aldrin walked once more to the churchyard gate. The gray ribbon he had tied fluttered among the others. Beyond it, the offerings waited. The household bells rested mute on linen. The great tower stood closed. From within, he imagined Orin moving alone in lamplight, checking rope, wheel, beam, and bronze. The sacred dawn approached, and all Grey Hollow, from youngest child to oldest keeper, seemed to breathe in one slow rhythm, preparing not for noise but for truth. The village was awake long before the sun. Nitrogen monoxide rooster announced the morning. Nitrogen monoxide dogs barked. Even the sheep seemed to have reached an agreement that this was not the day for unnecessary opinions, and every breath drifted before him in pale clouds. The mountain air carried that peculiar stillness found only just before dawn. Another day. People emerged from their homes one by one. No one wore fine clothing. Their garments were clean, carefully mended, simple. The ceremony did not require wealth. It required respect. Children held their parents' hands. Grandparents walked with carved staffs polished smooth by decades of use. The youngest babies slept peacefully, entirely unaware that generations before them had waited their whole lives for this morning. Aldrin found Orin waiting at the church gate. The old keeper already wore a thick wool cloak against the cold. Across one shoulder rested the great bell rope, neatly coiled. His face looked calm, not cheerful, not anxious, simply prepared. "You slept?" Orin asked. "A little. Good. You?" "I've had 83 years to prepare for today." "That sounds like enough." "It almost is." The old keeper studied the brightening eastern sky. "Walk with me." Together they crossed the churchyard. The villagers remained behind the low stone wall, watching silently as Orin approached the tower. Every eye followed him, not because he was important, because today his hands would perform a task that none of theirs could. At the tower door, its bow worn smooth, were countless fingers. "I thought only you carried this." "I do." "Then why?" "I am asking you to open the door." Aldrin stared at the key. "Why, May?" Orin smiled faintly. "Because every keeper needs someone else to witness that nitrogen monoxide tricks were hidden inside." "You trust me?" "I trust that you still know the difference between seeing and possessing." The mechanism resisted at first. Then, with a slow metallic groan, IT turned. The tower door opened. Cold air drifted outward. The darkness inside smelled exactly as IT had the day before. Stone, timber, OIL, and quiet. Orin accepted the key back without ceremony. "Come." The climb began. Behind them the villagers remained below. Only Orin and Aldrin would ascend. The spiral stair felt different today, not physically, emotionally. Every worm step seemed aware of its own history. Every curve of the wall held invisible memories of earlier, keepers making this same climb exactly 100 years apart. Halfway upward, Orin stopped beside one of the narrow windows. The valley stretched below, washed in pale dawn light. Smoke had not yet risen from the chimneys. Everything looked untouched. "You know," Orrin sighed quietly. He pointed toward the fields. "History is usually made by the people who plant again after winter." Then toward the bridge. "Or repair the stones after a flood. Or forgive a foolish neighbor because carrying anger into another harvest requires too much effort." His hand finally rested against the tower wall. "The bell remembers them." They climbed higher. At the second landing, Orrin opened the wooden chest. Inside rested a small linen bundle. He carefully unfolded IT. Within lay a pair of plain leather gloves, very old, beautifully maintained. "My mother's," he sighed. "You wear them? Every ringing. They still fit?" "Barely." He slipped them on slowly. The leather had darkened with age, but every stitch remained intact. "My grandfather always claimed gloves carried the memory of work better than hands did." "Did you believe him?" "No." That seemed reason enough. An unusual bit of medieval craftsmanship were rarely cast close to the churches where they eventually hung. Instead, entire communities sometimes helped prepare the clay molds, meaning a single bell could literally contain the labor of hundreds of ordinary hands before ever making its first sound. Perhaps that explained. The great bronze bell stood exactly. Letters seemed almost alive beneath the golden light. Orrin approached without speaking. He examined the oak. Every detail received one final inspection, not because he expected failure, because preparation deserved completion. Finally he nodded. "It is ready." Aldrin noticed something unusual near the base of the frame. Several tiny scratches, short vertical lines carved into one support beam. "So those are the notches," he sighed. Orrin looked where he pointed. "Yes." "One for each keeper?" "No. For each ringing, nitrogen monoxide." Aldrin frowned. "What are they?" "The years." He ran one gloved finger gently across them. "Each winter I carved another. Quietly measured an entire lifetime that way. Year after year, winter after winter, without applause, without certainty." Movement began in the churchyard. Families gathered around the ribbons. The small. "Do not listen for the sound." "What should I listen for?" "The silence afterward." Before Aldrin could ask another question, Valley. IT touched the church roof. The ribbons, the waiting villagers. Finally, steady breath, he wrapped both hands around the rope. The ancient fibers tightened. The great wheel overhead waited. The massive bell remained perfectly still. Far below, he could hear his own heartbeat. The appointed dawn had arrived. One movement remained, one pull. Again, with complete calm, his hands tightened gently upon the rope, and the waiting of 100 years came to its final breath. Orrin pulled. At first, nothing happened. The rope tightened. The wheel above gave a slow wooden creak. The great bell leaned slightly in its frame. Back, forward again. The clapper inside shifted. For one strange heartbeat, there was only the sound of ancient timber accepting its burden. Then bronze met iron. The bell rang once, not loudly at first, deep and round. The tower trembled. Dust loosened from hidden cracks. The rope shivered in Orrin's gloved hands. Below, the village did not move. The note rolled outward across Gray Hollow. IT crossed the churchyard, touched the ribbons, moved over. The linen cloth where the household bells lay silent. IT flowed along lanes and cottage walls, over gardens, sheepfolds, fields, and the little bridge. IT followed the stream, climbed the slopes, slipped between pines, and reached the stone marker on the northern road where moss hid the carved bell. Then the mountains answered, not with a second ring, with echo, a soft return from one ridge, then another farther away. Each echo came thinner, gentler, as though the valley were passing the sound from hand to hand and promising not to drop it. Aldrin understood, stood still, eyes open, face lifted toward the bell. Tears moved silently through. They belonged there as naturally as rain on stone. Below, the villagers remained motionless. Mara held both hands to her heart. Tavern, the beekeeper, bowed his head. A child began to cry, not from fear, but from the shock of feeling something enormous and kind pass through the world. Even the goats stopped plotting escape. That alone was nearly proof of holiness. The bell's voice faded slowly. It did not end all at once. It thinned, soft, drew itself back from the valley like sunlight, leaving a wall. For several moments afterward, Aldrin could still feel it vibrating in his bones. Then came the silence. Oren had warned him. Do not listen for the sound. Listen for the silence. Afterward, Aldrin listened. At first he heard nothing. Then he heard everything. The tiny, something stranger. No one hurried to explain. Explanations would have been rude, like interrupting snowfall. One small bronze bell on the linen cloth trembled. Then another. Then all of them together. They did not ring loudly. They answered with faint silver voices, each tone different. Cracked, clear, high, low, bright. Then a village of small sounds answering one great voice. The cracked bell trembled too. It made nitrogen monoxide sound, yet people watched it with the same reverence as the others. Mara later would say that even silence had answered. Aldrin believed her. The small bells settled. Only then did Oren release the rope. He stepped back carefully. The great bell returned to perfect stillness. Its century of speech was done. That was it? It felt longer. It always does. You heard it before? I was a boy, and now? Now I have kept my promise. Something in those words nearly broke Aldrin's heart. Memory stirred in Aldrin's mind, because that was where the metal revealed its hidden character. The first note belonged to force. The lingering sound belonged to nature. People were much the same. Perhaps anyone could be loud for a moment. What remained afterward told the deeper truth. Oren removed the gloves and folded them. His hands shook now, only slightly. Aldrin pretended not to notice, which was sometimes the kindest form of attention. Below, the villagers began to move. Slowly, families embraced. Neighbors who had stood apart stepped closer. One old man, not spoken in years, looked at each other across the ribbons. Neither moved at first. Then one opened her arms, and the other crossed the distance between them. Nitrogen monoxide, grand miracle. Nitrogen monoxide, sky-splitting open. Nitrogen monoxide, angelic. Choir with questionable tuning. Just people remembering that waiting 100 years to stay stubborn would be a bit excessive. Oren leaned against the wooden frame. Help me down. Of course. The descent was slower than the climb. At each landing, Oren paused. Not from weakness alone. He seemed to be leaving something behind on every step. Duty, memory, fear, perhaps even the version of himself who had been waiting all his life. When they reached the tower door, sunlight had fully entered the village. The people parted as Oren stepped out. No one cheered. Instead, they bowed their heads, one by one. The keeper looked embarrassed by this. His mouth twitched. That seems fair. The gray ribbon he had tied fluttered gently among the others. He had come expecting to hear a legend. Instead, he had watched a village listen itself back into shape. The first voice after the ringing belonged to a little boy. He looked up at his grandfather and asked, "Will IT ring again tomorrow?" A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, SOFT, and relieved. His grandfather patted his head. Lad, the boy frowned. That is poor planning. Even Oren laughed then, and somehow that laughter, arriving after the century's single peal, felt like the valley breathing out at last. After the laughter faded, Grey Hollow did not burst into celebration. That would have been too simple. And these were people who could make sweeping a doorstep feel ceremonial. If they ever hosted a feast with trumpets, someone would probably ask the trumpets to reflect quietly on their choices. Instead, the part Oren had told Aldrin to notice, the silence afterward. IT settled over Grey Hollow like a clean linen cloth spread across a table before bread is shared. No one seemed eager to break IT. Even the children, usually made of questions, mud, and suspiciously sticky fingers. From the far side of the square, an old woman stepped forward. Aldrin recognized her as the one who had rejected the frayed ribbon the day before. Her name, he had learned, was Elva. She walked with a carved cane and wore a blue scarf over her silver hair. Her eyes were sharp enough to slice cheese, which, in a village like Grey Hollow, was a genuinely useful quality. She approached another elder standing near the well, a narrow man named Corin. A wall. Aldrin waited for more. Mara sighed. A very important wall, apparently. Elva stopped before Corin. "My father moved the boundary stones," she sighed. Corin's face tightened. The square remained silent. "He did IT after the flood," Elva continued. "Your family lost land, ours gained IT. We knew." Corin looked at the ground. "My brother broke your orchard fence the next winter." "I knew," he blamed Deer. "Deer have better manners." Aldrin nearly laughed. "And that wall is uglier than both our tempers." Corin stared at the ribbon. Then he took IT. "My sons will move the stones back. My grandsons will help. And the orchard fence?" Elva sniffed. "You may repair it badly for tradition." The square exhaled. Not loudly, just enough. That was the first promise awakened by the bell. Others followed. A miller admitted his measures had been slightly unfair for years, though he insisted they were not unfair enough to make him interesting. A shepherd confessed. He had let his flock graze beyond the agreed ridge during drought. Two cousins who had not sat together since a marriage dispute approached one another and exchanged bread without speaking. One shook under enchantment. Nitrogen monoxide ghostly hand dragged confessions from unwilling mouths. The sound had simply, "and the stolen hens." Perhaps every century gathered its own hens, faint but unmistakable, crossing the ridges. Others had seen birds rise from the pines all at once. Their leader, a broad woman named Nesta, wore a green cloak and carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She bowed to Oren, then to the gathered villagers. "The sound reached us at dawn," she sighed. "So we came?" Oren nodded. "You remember the agreement?" "We remember enough to be ashamed." That answer moved through the crowd like wind through grain. The oilcloth bundle contained 3 carved wooden tablets. dark with age. They recorded shared rights to the marsh reeds, fishing channels, and winter grazing paths. Lomir had neglected the agreement for 2 generations, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of convenience, which is cruelty wearing comfortable shoes. Grey Hollow had complained. Lomir had delayed. Everyone had grown excellent at being offended. Now Nesta placed the tablets near the churchyard gate. "We will open the reed beds after first frost," she sighed. "As written. That bridge has been plotting murder for years. IT is a local tradition." The agreement was renewed with clasped hands. Nitrogen monoxide legal scribe appeared. Nitrogen monoxide wax seal glittered. Only witnesses. Memory. Aldrin learned that old agreements here were sometimes fed during ceremonies, not because anyone believed wood ate bread well, not most people, but because promises tied to hunger should never be renewed on empty symbolism alone. Practical, strange, and oddly beautiful. Medieval life had a way of making even paperwork smell faintly of rye. More visitors came. Came a nervous Reeve holding, a pouch of coins owed from tolls collected unfairly on the mountain road. That last one drew several raised eyebrows. Oren watched, all of it from beside the churchyard wall. He did not command. He did not judge. He merely listened. Aldrin stood beside him as disputes unfolded, softened, and changed shape. "Did you expect this?" Aldrin asked. "Yes." "All of it?" "No. People are very creative with foolishness." "And forgiveness?" "Sometimes." The afternoon became a weaving of old grievances and new commitments. Not everything was solved. Some matters were too tangled for one day. Some wounds remained tender. One man refused to speak to his brother, though he did agree to stand in the same square without making goat noises under his breath, which everyone seemed to consider progress. The bell had not created peace. IT had created an opening, a narrow one, ENOUGH, for people to step through, provided they did not insist on bringing every old resentment with them, like luggage for a long and unpleasant journey. As evening approached, fires were lit in the square. Food was shared among villagers and guests. The household bells were returned one by one to their owners, but nitrogen monoxide 1 rehung them yet. They rested in baskets, wrapped in cloth, as though they too were tired. Aldrin sat near the well, eating stew from a wooden bowl. Across the square, Elva and Corin argued about where the boundary stones should be placed. Their voices were sharp. Then Elva laughed. Apparently, peace did not mean silence. IT meant being able to argue without sharpening the knives. Mara sat beside Aldrin. "You look surprised." "I think I expected something more mystical." She dipped bread into her stew. Nothing more mystical than neighbors behaving themselves for half a day. That is a high miracle, nearly impossible. Above them the tower stood dark against the deepening sky. The great bell had returned to stillness, but its work continued below in hands, words, bread, tablets, ribbons, and reluctant apologies. The valley had listened, carefully, and what it heard was not a command from heaven or a curse from the past. IT heard the weight of promises, stubborn, ordinary people trying, awkwardly and imperfectly, to become lighter. For the first time, he understood why a bell might only need to ring once a century. Any more often, people might forget how hard listening truly was. Morning returned to Grey Hollow. No flock of glowing birds had carried away the village's secrets. Life with remarkable confidence, resumed being life. A rooster once again believed himself responsible for the sunrise. He remained incorrect, but admirably committed. The square filled with neighbors and visitors sharing breakfast. The fires from the previous evening had burned down to glowing embers, and the smell of warm bread mingled with wood smoke and freshly brewed herb tea. Yet something had undeniably changed. People smiled more easily, not constantly. That would have looked suspicious, but old stiffness had softened. Aldrin noticed Elva and Corin discussing the boundary stones again. This time they argued over where to plant wildflowers once the wall had been moved. Progress, he thought, often sounded remarkably similar to disagreement. Orin sat quietly beneath the yew tree, eating a piece of rye bread spread with fresh honey. Without the great responsibility of the ringing resting before him, he had been carrying an invisible pack for decades and had finally set IT down. Aldrin joined him. "You seem different." "I slept only now?" "The first honest sleep in many years." "You feared something would happen?" "I feared I would fail." "You didn't?" "No." Orin looked toward the tower. "But fear rarely listens to reason." "Keeper." Orin smiled. "Ah, you knew she was coming?" "I hoped." Carefully upon the grass. Inside were several thick bundles of parchment wrapped in linen. Aldrin leaned forward. "What are those?" "Our oldest records." "Good. I thought you should see them." She untied the first bundle. Ancient pages appeared beneath the cloth, their edges darkened with age but carefully preserved. Some sheets were made from parchment, others from thin, scraped leather. A few bore faded wax seals that had long since cracked. Across the top of the first page, written in elegant but weathered script, stood a single title, "The Agreements of the Three Valleys." Aldrin felt his pulse quicken. So they truly exist. "They always existed," Orin replied. "The question is whether anyone bothers reading them." Lysa smiled. "My students complain they are boring." "They are. They also complain they're too long." "They are. Then why preserve them?" Aldrin examined the pages. There were nitrogen monoxide, tales of dragons. Nitrogen monoxide, miraculous prophecies. Instead, harsh winter's fires, our failed harvests. Everything astonishingly practical. I expected legends. Orin nodded. Everyone dozed, and instead, instructions. Aldrin turned another page. One passage immediately caught his attention. "When one valley prospers while another starves, the prosperous valley shall lend grain without demanding land." He looked up. "That seems unusually generous." It was also practical. "How so?" "Hungry neighbors eventually become desperate neighbors." That was difficult to argue with. Another page described how each village should contribute labor to repairing mountain roads damaged by storms. Another detailed fair prices for millstones. Another instructed that orphan children should be welcomed by whichever household had room. Appeared near the margin of one particularly old page. Tiny drawings of hands. Medieval scribes sometimes used little illustrations instead of elaborate headings, especially in local records. A pointing hand, known by some copyists as a manicule, helped readers notice especially important passages long before colorful bookmarks existed. Aldrin found the little ink hands oddly cheerful, as though generations of scribes had been politely tapping future readers on the shoulder. Further into the collection, considerably, the writing was more difficult to read. The founding account, she whispered. Aaron's expression grew thoughtful. Read IT. 107 years before the casting of the great bell, the valleys quarreled greatly. Aldrin listened intently. The account described years of growing mistrust, disputes over rivers, arguments about timber, shepherds accused of stealing grazing land, millers accused of dishonest weights, merchants favoring one village over another, small grievances multiplying quietly until they became habits. Eventually came a terrible winter. Snow blocked, refused to help one another. Families suffered needlessly, not because the land lacked enough, because pride prevented sharing. WHEN spring finally arrived. Survivors gathered together, ashamed, exhausted, determined never to repeat such foolishness. So they wrote agreements, Aldrin sighed softly. They did. Orin answered. And the bell? The bell came later. WHY? Because written promises fade. Aldrin looked at the old pages. The ink lasts. The ink knows. The people don't. Someone realized every agreement eventually becomes ordinary. And ordinary things are forgotten. Exactly. Sulfur monoxide, they cast the bell. Not to create memory. He tapped the parchment gently to awaken IT. Everything suddenly fit together. The carvings, the ribbons, the offerings, the household bells, the yearly notches, the single ringing. None of it existed to preserve a miracle. IT preserved attention every century. My grandfather quoted that rule about shared wells. A blacksmith replied. So did mine. Lysa smiled. They probably never realized they were quoting this. Generations had carried fragments of the document in memory, long after forgetting where those words originated, like songs whose composers disappeared centuries earlier. Late that afternoon, Aldrin accompanied Orin back into the tower, not to ring the bell. Its work was finished. Instead, Orin carefully secured the great rope once more. Together they wound IT through its guiding rings until IT rested, safely beyond easy reach. IT sleeps again, Aldrin observed. No. Orin tightened the final knot. IT waits. There is a difference? A very great one. The old keeper rested his hand briefly against the ancient bronze. She charged less. They descended the stairs slowly. At the lowest landing, they were reminders disguised as art, because people remembered stories longer than instructions. Outside, especially by elders whose knees had entered formal negotiations with age and were losing badly. People came from roads Aldrin had not even noticed before. They arrived in small groups, not as armies of pilgrims, but as curious clusters of humanity carrying walking sticks, bundles, questions, and the unshakable belief that someone else knew where they were supposed to sleep. A mother and two daughters came from the western ridge. A group of monks came from a priory beyond the marsh. 3 merchants arrived with pack mules, one of which looked personally offended by mountains. A wandering harpist appeared wearing a hat with a feather far too confident for the weather. They had all heard the bell, or heard someone describe hearing IT, or heard someone describe someone else describing IT, then demanded stories in payment. Orin watched from the churchyard wall. You dislike visitors? I dislike crowds. There are only 30. That is a crowd when 29 have questions. The visitors wanted to see the bell. Orin sighed nitrogen monoxide. They wanted to touch the rope. Orin sighed nitrogen monoxide again, faster. They wanted to know whether the sound cured illness, revealed lies, blessed marriages, predicted harvests, or improved cheese. Orrin stared at that last question for a very long time, then sighed cheese must improve itself. One monk, Brother Pell, carried a little writing tablet and asked Aldrin whether he had personally witnessed the ringing. "I did." "What did IT sound like?" Aldrin opened his mouth, then closed IT, then tried again, like a mountain remembering mercy. Had anyone fainted? Had ghosts appeared? Not even one, not even a modest one. That weakens the ballad. Truth often does. An eccentric curiosity emerged when the monks inspected the small household bells. Brother Pell explained that some medieval communities gave bells names and even blessed them almost like living beings, because bells were thought to have voices, duties, and temperaments. One abbey he knew kept records of a bell called Gentle Agnes, though apparently Agnes had cracked during a winter storm, proving that even gentle souls had limits. By afternoon, the visitors began changing the village simply by needing things. More bread had to be baked, more water drawn, extra straw brought into barns for sleeping. The common hall filled with murmuring strangers. Gray Hollow's quiet lanes became busy, and not everyone enjoyed this. A farmer complained that pilgrims had leaned on his fence. A child lost a wooden sheep. One merchant tried to buy an old doorway bell from a widow, and the resulting silence around him became sulfur monoxide cold. Then, with a kind of smile that makes groan, men reconsidered their childhood. The bell was not for sale. Neither were its echoes. That evening, Orrin gathered the visitors in the square. He stood beside the well, staff in hand. "But understand this. Carry home what IT awakened. Repair what you have neglected. Return what you borrowed too long. Forgive where you can. Feed someone who hungers before explaining why they should have planned better." No one spoke. The instruction was not glamorous. That made IT harder to escape. The next day, slightly sour, like people who had ordered thunder and received household accounting. But others stayed. Brother Pell copied portions of the valley agreements so his priory could preserve them. The harpist asked permission to compose a song not about magic, but about waiting. Orrin told him this was acceptable, provided the song did not contain a dragon. The harpist looked wounded. One small dragon? No, a symbolic dragon, especially nitrogen monoxide. Meanwhile, several travelers helped repair the northern bridge before departing. The 3 merchants donated iron nails, perhaps from generosity, perhaps because Mara had looked at them again. Motives. People from outside noticed things. Gray Hollow. A young woman from the western ridge told Mara, "You live as though memory is a crop." Mara considered this. IT must be tended, and harvested, and reseeded. Aldrin carried that phrase for the rest of the day. By the 4th evening, Gray Hollow had settled into a new rhythm. Visitors came and went. Bridge repairs, copied records, reconciled neighbors, plucked a gentle tune, trying to make silence musical without ruining IT. That was ambitious work, like teaching a stone to dance, but politely. Orrin lowered himself beside Aldrin with a sigh. "You will leave soon," the keeper sighed. "I suppose. You heard what you came to hear." "I'm not sure I did." Orrin smiled. "Good. Certainty makes poor traveling company." Across the village, Brother Pell was teaching children to draw little pointing hands in manuscript margins. The children were making Because scholarship begins somewhere. Aldrin laughed softly. The echo had brought strangers. The strangers had brought questions. And questions, handled carefully, had become gifts. The bell's voice had rung once, but its echo continued traveling through human mouths, human hands, and human choices. Not pure, not perfect, but alive. The matter of Aron's successor began with a broken latch that seemed appropriate. Great changes rarely enter politely through the front door. They usually slip in through some small, which the latch probably considered a victory. Then a girl named Sella fixed IT. She was 16, narrow-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and usually seen carrying either a basket of tools or a baby sibling, sometimes both, which suggested she possessed more discipline than most kings. Aldrin watched her remove the latch plate, clean packed grit from behind IT, shave a sliver from the swollen wood, oil the hinge pin, and set everything back so neatly that the door opened without complaint. Oren watched, too. He sighed nothing, but Aldrin noticed. Old keepers did not stare at repairs unless they were measuring more than wood. Later, near the tower gate, Oren asked, "Who taught her?" Mara, mending a sleeve nearby, answered, "Her father first, then everyone else after he died. She listens to things people do not hear." Oren nodded once. That was all. The next day he asked Sella to bring him a hammer. She brought 3. "Why 3?" he asked. "One for nails, one for pegs, and one because men always ask for a hammer without knowing which hammer they mean." Oren looked delighted. Aldrin nearly applauded. From then on, Sella appeared often near the churchyard. At first she carried tools, rope, oil, wedges, and cloth. Then Oren began asking her questions. "What does cracked oak sound like? DULL. What does loose iron smell like after rain? Rust and old blood. Wrong. Rust and whetstone. Better." Sella accepted praise like someone accepting a hot coal. Carefully, briefly, and without making a fuss. Aldrin found her one afternoon sitting beneath the yew tree, carving a small wooden mouse. IT had enormous ears and an expression of deep suspicion. "For the tower?" he asked. "For Oren. He will like IT. He will pretend not to. That means he will love IT." She smiled without looking up, fetching, holding, repeating, yet not everyone approved. One evening 2 village men spoke near the well. Unaware Aldrin stood close enough to hear. "A girl keeper?" One sighed. Oren's mother was keeper. That was different. How? She was already old. She was born old, was she? The first man grumbled. "She is too young." Though he denies IT. The argument traveled through the village in whispers. Some thought Sella clever but untested. Others sighed the tower required strength. Mara pointed out that strength was useful, yes, but so was knowing which end of a chisel not to lick. This ended one discussion rather efficiently. Oren ignored the murmuring for 3. The tower stood behind him. Bronze hidden above, silence restored. Sella stood apart near the churchyard wall, clearly wishing to become invisible and having nitrogen monoxide success. Oren leaned on his staff. "I am old," he sighed. A child whispered, "Very." His mother covered his mouth. Oren continued as though he had not heard, though he absolutely had. "The bell is rung. My promise is kept. But the tower remains. The rope remains. The next century has already begun, whether we are sentimental about IT or not. The villagers listened. A keeper is not chosen for age, pride, bloodline, height, beard, or ability to look meaningful while staring at clouds. Several people glanced at Aldrin. He chose dignity and looked at the ground. A keeper is chosen because they hear what must be tended before it breaks. Oren turned to Sella. "Come here." She froze, then walked forward. He handed her his staff, the notched staff. 99. Marks carved before the 100th dawn. Sella held IT with both hands. Oren sighed. "You will not be keeper yet." A murmur moved through the crowd. "You will learn. You will fail in small ways, which is useful. You will be corrected, which is unpleasant. You will correct others, which is more unpleasant. When I cannot climb, you will climb for me. When I cannot hear the beams, you will listen. When I die, the village will decide." Sella swallowed. "And if they choose someone else, then teach them properly." The murmuring faded. One by one, villagers nodded. Not everyone eagerly, but enough. Mara stepped forward first and tied a white ribbon around. Elva added red. "Do not cry on the staff. IT swells the wood." She laughed then. So did the village. The next morning, he glimpsed their shadows turning upward, step by step. When they emerged into the bell chamber, the sun had just touched the roof. Nitrogen monoxide sound came. Nitrogen monoxide ceremony below. Just a young woman learning where to place her hands. Where the stone dipped, where the wind pushed hardest, where old wood needed listening. That was how centuries survived. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the passing of attention from one pair of hands to another. When Sella descended, dust marked her sleeves and pride lit her face, despite her attempt to hide IT. Oren looked tired, also pleased. Aldrin understood. Then that the bell had not only awakened old promises, IT had begun making new ones. The first snow arrived earlier than anyone expected. Not enough to bury the valley, just enough to remind every sensible person that winter had already started making plans. Thin white lines appeared along the mountain ridges one morning, and by afternoon a delicate dusting rested on rooftops, stone walls, and the branches of the old yew tree beside the church. Gray Hollow seemed to welcome IT. Children hurried outside to leave the first footprints. Shepherds counted their flocks twice. Mara sighed at the sky and immediately began baking enough bread to feed. Of how many days he had stayed. He had arrived intending to spend perhaps 3 nights. Instead, the valley had quietly rearranged his sense of time. That, he decided, was the most polite kind of enchantment. Their wagons noticeably lighter after donating nails, grain, and a suspiciously large quantity of lamp oil. Gray Hollow grew quiet again, not empty, settled, like a book, gently closing after its most important chapter. Aldrin found Oren in the churchyard one crisp morning, repairing the small wooden gate, not because it was broken, because one hinge had begun to squeak. "It still works," Aldrin observed. "For Mal, you could wait until spring." "I could." Oren tightened the hinge pin. "But then I would be repairing damage instead of preventing IT." That seemed to describe far more than gates. Sella arrived carrying a small basket of tools. Without speaking, she handed Oren exactly the chisel he needed. He accepted IT without looking. Neither appeared to notice how perfectly They had learned each other's habits. Aldrin noticed. The apprenticeship had already begun changing both of them. Later, that afternoon, Orin invited Aldrin to walk beyond the northern fields. They followed a narrow path, climbing gently toward the old stone marker, where Aldrin had first seen the carved bell beneath the moss. Snow rested lightly upon it now. Orin brushed the surface clean with his glove. There, the carving appeared once more. Simple, patient, timeless. I have wondered about this, Aldrin admitted. It marks more than a road. It marks a promise. Orin rested one hand upon the weathered stone. Every keeper visits here after the ringing. WHY? To remember that stories always leave. Aldrin frowned. I don't understand. The bell remains. The valley remains. But the story walks away. The realization settled gently. He had believed himself only a witness. Instead, long before printed books became common, news, customs, songs, and practical knowledge moved from village to village through merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and wanderers who simply remembered well enough to repeat faithfully. Roads carried stories as surely as they carried carts. Perhaps that had always been the true road beneath his feet. As they turned back toward Gray Hollow, snowflakes began falling again, large, unhurried. Each one drifted differently through the cold afternoon air. By the time they reached the village, the rooftops had whitened completely. Children immediately declared this the greatest snowfall in history. The elders quietly disagreed. Everyone was probably correct according to their own measurements. That evening the villagers gathered for a modest meal in the common hall. Nothing ceremonial had been planned. Simply stew, fresh bread, warm cider without much excitement hiding inside it. Conversation wandered comfortably from sheep to weather, from fences to next year's planting. Life had resumed its familiar shape. At one point, Elva stood. She carried a small wooden box. I have something. She crossed the room to Corian. 30 years of disagreement now looked remarkably small beneath the soft glow of the lamps. She opened the box. Inside lay a handful of old iron nails. My father took these when he moved the boundary wall. Corin stared. I thought they were lost. They were. She smiled. In my attic. The room laughed. Corin accepted the nails. I shall return them. You just did. Even Orin chuckled quietly. Aldrin realized that reconciliation rarely arrived dressed in grand speeches. Sometimes it was not a question. I think I must. You have other roads. I do. She looked toward the tower. I've never left the valley. You will. Perhaps. What would you want to see? She thought carefully. Not castles. Nitrogen monoxide? They seem drafty. Aldrin laughed. Fair. She handed him the little carved mouse she had made weeks earlier. It's oversized. Ears made it appear permanently curious. For the road. I can't take this. You can. What if the tower needs another mouse? I'll carve one. The following morning dawned bright beneath fresh snow. Smoke rose straight upward into. Despite repeated protests, Elva insisted he carry an extra loaf. Corin quietly slipped several iron nails into his pack. For luck. I thought you just got them back. I did. So why? They're different nails. He stood beside Orin at the village edge. Neither spoke for a while. Snow crunched softly beneath their boots. The mountains shone white beneath the pale winter sun. You have done what every traveler eventually must. Or inside? Witches? Leave? I suppose so. The keeper smiled gently. Good. Good? If stories never left home, nitrogen monoxide, one else would learn them. Aldrin looked once more toward the tower rising above Gray Hollow. Silent, watching, waiting. He had arrived chasing a legend. He departed carrying something far quieter, and perhaps far more lasting. The road out of Gray Hollow was quieter than Aldrin remembered. Not into the white powder with each step, leaving a trail that already began to blur behind him as new flakes settled over IT. The mountains stood like patient witnesses. The same peaks he had followed on the way in now watched him leave without comment. Behind him, Gray Hollow grew smaller, not fading, simply returning to the size IT had always been. A village is never truly large when seen from the right distance. IT only feels large when you are inside IT, trying to understand IT all at once. Aldrin paused once on a rise where the road bent sharply. From there he could see the valley in full. The church tower rose above the rooftops, its bell chamber dark and still. Smoke curled from chimneys. Tiny figures moved between homes and barns. The stream cut a silver line through white fields. Ordinary, extraordinary, both. At the same time, he touched the wooden mouse in his satchel. Sella's carving felt warm from his hand earlier. He wondered what she was doing now. Climbing the tower, perhaps. Repairing a hinge. Listening to wood that most people would never hear speaking. The thought pleased him. As he continued walking, the road lead him past the old stone marker again. He stopped. Snow had gathered in the carved bell, softening its edges. He brushed IT away carefully. The symbol reappeared, a simple shape, a promise preserved in stone. For a moment, he imagined all the hands that had passed this way before him. Merchants, pilgrims, shepherds, messengers, other travelers who had looked at the same carving and wondered what lay beyond IT. How many had heard the bell? How many had believed IT? How many had forgotten IT entirely? Then continued. The road descended into forest. Branches overhead formed a pale archway of snow-laden limbs. Occasional birds shifted above him, sending soft cascades of white drifting down like slow applause. The world felt larger out here, not because IT had expanded, but because there was nitrogen monoxide single sound holding it together anymore. In Gray Hollow, everything had once been oriented around waiting. Here everything simply moved. He walked until midday. At a small clearing, he stopped to rest near a frozen stream. The ice was thin in places. Listened for the silence afterward. He had assumed silence meant absence. Now he understood IT. He heard IT again. Not the ringing itself, but the way the sound had arrived, like something ancient remembering. But he was not. An eccentric piece of lore surfaced in his mind. Something a wandering storyteller had once told him in a different valley years ago. That in some traditions, bells were believed not merely to announce events, but to separate one moment of time from the next. A ringing was not just sound, it was a boundary, a line drawn in air. Walking. By late afternoon, the snow began to thin. The forest opened into gentler hills. Far ahead, the road split in several directions. Aldrin stopped at the fork. One path lead south toward larger towns and trade roads. Choosing a direction is important. In truth, he had learned, Gray Hollow was nitrogen monoxide, longer visible, yet he could still feel IT, not as a place, as a pattern. He adjusted his satchel. The wooden mouse shifted inside, its small carved ears pressing against the cloth. Aldrin smiled slightly. Well, he sighed to nitrogen monoxide 1 in particular. That's that. Then he chose a road, not because IT called louder than the others, but because it was there, and because, somewhere behind him, a bell had once taught him that listening mattered more than certainty. He walked on. The wind picked up gently through the hills. Snow began to fall again, lighter this time, like the world turning a page IT had already read, but still respected enough to reread slowly. And somewhere far behind him, in a valley tucked between mountains, a village continued its quiet work of remembering how to live together. The road west was the one Aldrin chose, without ceremony. No dramatic reason. Nitrogen monoxide prophetic dream. Nitrogen monoxide, sudden pull of destiny, tugging at his sleeve like an impatient child. Just a road, and the quiet understanding that wherever he went next, he would still be carrying Gray Hollow with him, whether he intended to or not. Snow lightened, only reminded. By the second day, the hills had opened into wide rolling fields, where winter wheat lay dormant beneath thin white frost. Fences appeared more frequently, then villages, then scattered farms with smoke rising from chimneys like patient questions. Life resumed its familiar rhythm everywhere he went. But Aldrin noticed something subtle now. In one village, a farmer paused before selling grain to a stranger, as if remembering something unspoken. In another, two neighbors argued briefly over water rights, then stopped, laughed, and measured the channels again together. In a roadside chapel, a bell was rung for nitrogen monoxide clear reason at midday. None of them knew why. Or perhaps they did not remember knowing, but something had moved through the world and left its echo behind. Aldrin did not explain IT to anyone. He understood now that explanations were fragile things. They either became stories or arguments, and neither was as important as the experience itself. He simply walked. Days blurred gently into one another. He stopped at a small inn near a river crossing. The innkeeper, a broad woman with flour on her sleeves, anywhere worth telling. He considered this, then nodded slightly. Yes. She placed a bowl of stew in front of him. Tell IT, then. Aldrin stared into the steam rising from the food. For a moment, he almost did. He almost spoke of the bell, the valley, the keeper, the apprentice, the silence afterward that had felt louder than sound. But something stopped him. Not reluctance, not secrecy. The innkeeper raised an eyebrow. That sounds like the beginning of a long tale. It is. Do you know how IT ends? A villagers mending things they had stopped noticing were broken. I think, he sighed carefully, it doesn't really end. The innkeeper nodded as if that made perfect sense. That's the best kind. Later that night, as rain tapped gently against the window, Aldrin sat alone by the fire. He took the wooden mouse from his satchel, turned IT in his hands. IT still felt simple, still felt Sem-A-L-L, and yet IT carried something he could not quite name, not magic, not memory alone, something closer to responsibility. Outside, the river moved steadily through the dark, indifferent to stories, yet somehow part of all of them. Aldrin thought of Orrin's words one last time. listened for the silence afterward. He finally understood what the keeper had meant. The bell had not been an ending. It had been a reminder that every ending creates space, and in that space, people decide what kind of world continues. He placed the wooden mouse back into his satchel, then leaned back in his chair. The fire crackled softly. Time moved on, as IT always did, somewhere far away, beyond hills and rivers and roads that bent like questions. A valley continued to live beneath a silent tower, and though the bell would not ring again for another century, its echo would travel wherever people remembered to listen, not only for sound, but for what remained after it. Aldrin closed his eyes, and for the first time since leaving Gray Hollow, he did not feel like a traveler passing through a story. He felt like part of one,